Hello, everyone, and welcome to online lecture 19, Process of Conducting a Study. So this lecture will be on the shorter side and we'll actually have some review points for you. There will be some new important information, but basically what we're going to do now is tie together everything we've learned about and then talk about how we go through the process of conducting a study. Okay, so let's get into it. One of the first things you want to think about when conducting a study is institutional approval. And if you are using animals, that would be through the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or IACUC. And if it's for humans, it'll be through the Institutional Review Board. So IACUC will review research protocols for studies using non-human animals and determines if proposed procedures are ethical. And by ethical, they mean avoid or minimize pain and discomfort. So I know animal research is certainly a controversial topic, but remember we talked about animal rights versus animal welfare, and IACUC primarily deals with animal welfare, not animal rights. Okay. The Institutional Review Board, on the other hand, reviews research protocols for studying humans participants. Primary concern is participant welfare. And so we want to know that the participants are being treated well, that informed consent has been obtained, and that the benefits of the study outweigh the risks to participants. Okay. So how do we choose our research participants? How do we actually obtain them? Well, choosing participants depends a lot on the research question. What are we studying? Now, for obtaining animals, the Animal Welfare Act regulates care and housing, and Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals provides a guide to using animals appropriately. If we're working with human participants, well, then recruitment definitely depends on the type of participant needed, right? For example, let's say your research question dictates homeless participants. Then you would contact homeless shelters and visit areas frequented by people who are homeless. If your research question, on the other hand, dictates the use of school children as participants, then you might contact schools and possibly pediatricians' offices. Now, I will tell you that a convenient sample of college students are often used in psychological research. So that may not be representative of the target population, and that's definitely an issue. Now, in recent years, the internet has become a very popular place to recruit participants. The nice part about that is it provides access to a larger and more diverse sample than otherwise possible, right? That makes sense that we could get a wider variety of people. The disadvantage? Well, certain groups may not have access to internet even today, that is true. And the sample may not be representative of the target population. I think we talked about some other disadvantages as well a little while back, right? That your participants may walk away in the middle of a study, or they may take your study more than once unless you have controls around that. But no matter how the participants are recruited, it's important to report how participants were selected and assigned to the research conditions. That's in the method section. So now let's talk a little bit about power. Because in addition to thinking about how to recruit your participants, you have to think about how many. Okay, so for the purposes of this class, we've talked about particular restrictions in terms of power. in terms of number of participants. And you're going to be allowed to do up to 30 participants per group, or 60 participants total. Okay. However, in general, when you're conducting a study, you want to consider power. What's power? It's the probability of correctly rejecting the null hypothesis, or the probability of correctly saying that the experimental condition produced an effect. Now, in general, we want a power of at least 0.80 or 80%. Why? Because we want to correctly reject a false null at least 80% of the time. In other words, if there is an effect out there that we are hoping to find, we want to find that effect at least 80% of the time. So how can we ensure that we have that kind of power? Well, the best way is to increase our sample size. As sample size increases, power increases. However, so does the time and money required to complete the research. So in general, it would be nice to have a really, really large sample size, all right, especially considering that you're not actually going to recruit any real participants for your study, right? It's all going to be data given by me. But in order to be realistic in terms of the amount of data that you can actually have, and to keep your power nice for the kind of analyses that you're going to conduct, like I said, we're going to restrict it to 60 total, max of 30 per group. If you have 3 groups, that would be 20 per group. Okay. So the alpha level, that's another way to influence power. As alpha increases, power increases. However, we will set alpha to 0.05. So here's the thing. As alpha increases, power would increase. So you might think, well, why not just increase alpha a lot? Remember, alpha is the same as your type 1 error. Alpha is the same as your type 1 error. We do not like type 1 error in psychology or in the behavioral sciences. So we try to keep our alpha really low, 0.05 or lower. So even though we could increase alpha to increase our power, we generally don't do this. The third way to influence power is to increase effect size, to increase the magnitude or the size of the relationship between 2 variables in a population. Well, that's great, but it's not easy to do. It's not easy to really increase our magnitude. So really, the most practical way to increase power is to increase sample size. That is the most common, the most practical, the most popular way to increase power, increase sample size. Okay. So to estimate a sample size, you might want to conduct a power analysis. And to do that, software programs are typically used because doing it by hand is really kind of a stretch. It's a complicated set of formulas to use. It can be done, and it used to be done, but now people tend to use software programs such as G-Power and Power and Sample Size through Vanderbilt. They're both free. They're both very nice, excellent programs that you can use if you need to conduct a power analysis. You won't need to do so for this class, but if you're going forward and continue on in research, this may come up for you. Okay. So at the end of the day, how many research participants should be included in the research? Well, you really have to balance practicality with the increased power that accompanies a large sample. In other words, it's always nice to have more power, and it's always nice to have more sample, a larger sample, but it's not always realistic. So we have to balance these things out. Okay. The next topic is apparatus, measures, and/or instruments. So how will the IV be manipulated or observed? And how will the DV, or dependent variable, be measured? So we have to figure out what we're doing with our independent variable and what we're doing with our dependent variable. And of course, this also depends on the nature of the research. Now, if you are measuring any psychological construct, I would absolutely like to see you use a measure that's already been used, not to create your own. That's more work to create your own, and plus you won't be able to get the reliability and validity that you could with an already established measure. So where do you find measures? How do you go about finding them? Well, we talked about some of these resources before, but let's talk about them again. The Mental Measurements Yearbook, Tests in Print, these are all databases. HAPI, Health and Psychosocial Instruments, PsycInfo, PsycArticles, PubMed, Medline, and one that I didn't list here, but you can use is Google Scholar. That's another nice option for how to get information about tests. Okay. I will say that if you're finding yourself really stuck in finding a measure, you can always reach out to me as well. I'm another resource for you because I have a whole bunch of measures collected. Okay. Procedure and scheduling. Procedure, if you recall, is the detailed description of how the experiment will be conducted. And it's important to allow for future replication of a study. Okay, just like we went through our examples in class of procedure regarding making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or wrapping a gift, you want to be just as detailed in your description of how your experiment would be conducted. Next, scheduling of research participants. Well, of course, that has to do with the availability of the researcher and the participants. The important point here is to anticipate that some participants will drop out, especially in longitudinal studies, especially when you need them to participate more than once. Okay. Now, informed consent is necessary unless waived by the IRB. The consent form should include the following elements: basic information, procedures, benefits, risks, and compensation. If it's a sensitive topic like depression or abuse, extra information for individuals who need assistance is appropriate. Okay, you might provide some resources about where they can reach out, local counseling center, crisis center, where they can reach out if they have any issues that come up post the research. Participants must be informed that they can withdraw from the study at any time or refuse to answer any question without any penalty, right? So if you have decided that you would give each participant a little remuneration for participating, let's say you've decided to give each participant a pen, they should still get that pen even if they decide to withdraw at some point. Participants must be informed as to how the records and data obtained will be kept confidential. It's another important piece, right? How are you going to keep their records private and confidential? Okay. Common procedures are to, especially now that all of our records tend to be very electronic, we're not dealing with paper typically. So as that trend has increased, we're talking about password protection, we're talking about locked computers, those sort of things. Okay. Now, for your study, you will be pulling together an informed consent using that template that I have provided for you. Now, of course, you will not be handing it out to anyone because you're not actually obtaining any participants, but you will actually put one together just to get the experience of how you would do that. Okay. Instructions and data collection. For instructions, you want it to be precise yet simple. So specific, but not overly complicated. And you want to refrain from certain phrases that don't actually, it's tempting, but it doesn't actually help the participant in the way that we would hope it would. So certain phrases like pay attention, relax, ignore distractions don't really help. But what really does help are warm-up trials. They can assess the understanding of participants of the instructions. So if we want to know if participants understand the instructions, consider a warm-up trial. Okay, and this of course would be if you can afford to do that, if that wouldn't give away the whole research, then you might think about it. Okay, and your data collection will, of course, follow the selected research design. Okay. So now you've actually conducted your study and you need to debrief your participants. Now, we did talk about debriefing alongside deception. And that's true. When you do deception, and I think for most studies, there's at least some small part of deception because we don't necessarily want our participants to know exactly what we're studying because that could bias their responses. But even when there's no deception, we still want to debrief. So why? What are the functions of debriefing? The first one is ethical. To undo deception, to decrease stress or risk, and to attempt to return participants to a pre-experimental state. Next one is educational. Now, this mostly applies to students participating in research, but part of being a student is learning about new pieces, learning about new things, and you can help students that would participate in your research by explaining to them what it was that you actually did. Methodological. Now, this would help you to establish the effectiveness of an independent variable or a deception. In other words, you can judge the accuracy of participants' suspicions and perceptions. Did they figure out what the independent variable was? Is that okay or not okay? Did the deception that you wanted to employ actually work? And finally, a sense of satisfaction, participants feeling as if they contributed to science and society. Because as always in debriefing, we always thank our participants and tell them that they really did contribute in an important way to this research. So we hope that that gives them a sense of satisfaction. So that's some of the debriefing functions. So now how to debrief. We generally prefer to debrief face-to-face. We begin by asking if the participant has any questions. We might question the participant to determine if all aspects of the study were clear. Did you understand you were supposed to do this, then that? Did you understand you were supposed to remember all these words? Did you understand that even if you remembered a new word on trial 4, you were still supposed to tell us about it? If deception was used, you want to attempt to determine if the participant discerned the true nature of the study. Did your deception work? And explain the purpose of using deception. So again, if you're doing a study to understand how light during the day impacts our mood, then you might want the participants not to know that you're studying about light. Maybe you asked a whole bunch of questions aside from just about the light outside, how bright and sunny it was outside, in addition to mood. And you would want to know, did they figure out it was about light and mood? Okay. And then, of course, you want to ask participants not to reveal the details of the experiment to other participants. That's an important piece as well. Because we still have to, unless they're the last participant you're ever going to run, you still have more participants. You don't want them to know what the study was actually about if you're using a form of deception. Okay. Now, one thing that you could consider doing, and this really isn't, I don't think it's appropriate for this class unless you have a very specific reason for doing it, but you could do a pilot study, which is a brief run through of the entire experiment with just a few participants prior to the actual collection of data. And this is clever because it serves many purposes. It establishes the clarity of the instructions. It provides evidence that the IV, that the independent variable, is being manipulated or observed adequately. And it familiarizes the researcher with the procedure. Now, you wouldn't actually necessarily use this data, but it would provide good information for you for the actual study. Okay. You might even use it to learn more about a measure, if a measure is working well. Okay. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you about the process of conducting a study. Hopefully that helps you to review a little bit as well as to have some new information about that process. So I will talk to you next time. Stay well and take care.